Okay, so the basic problem in writing an abstract is that you have tons of information you need to convey, but a very short space in which to convey it. And so you have to radically oversimplify and streamline everything about your research in order to do this effectively. Right? So that said, how are we going to do that? Well, first let's look at what some abstracts look like. So I've just pulled out a couple examples kind of at random from conferences that I've applied to in the past. This one is the Linguistic Society of America annual meeting. And this is a large conference. This is the largest professional organization in the world for basic linguistics. And so this is one of the largest basic linguistics conferences that exist. It happens yearly somewhere in the United States. It switches from year to year. And it's a very general conference. It's all areas of basic linguistics and maybe even a little bit of applied linguistics. And there's often hundreds and hundreds of people at this, like over 1,000 people, which for neuroscience wouldn't even be that big, but for linguistics, that is a gigantic conference, right? And it's more general. So what are their format guidelines like? Well, they have to be PDFs. It should be no more than 500 words and no more than one page. Don't make it any smaller than 10 points. And then there's all these formatting suggestions about the margins. Abstracts exceeding the word or page length limit or in type smaller than 10 point will be rejected without being evaluated. And when they say that, they mean it. They're getting hundreds of abstracts submitted to this conference, and they don't have time to deal with people who don't conform to the formatting requirements. You have to anonymize it. Don't put your name on the abstract itself. That's pretty normal. Most conferences don't want your name on the abstract. If you identify yourself, we'll reject it, right? So these are pretty harsh guidelines, but this is pretty typical of a larger conference. Yeah, and then apparently at this conference, they make you give an even shorter abstract for putting into the meeting handbook so people can look through the handbook for the conference and see what kinds of talks were given there. That's unusual. It's actually pretty annoying that they make you rewrite the abstract in an even shorter form, but that's something specific to this conference. So what is 500 words like? This is what 500 words looks like. So this is an abstract I submitted to this conference a few years ago. And this is like roughly a page of type, so it's not the shortest possible one I've ever seen, but this is a very short summary of some very involved work, and this is all you get, right? So we're really going to need to simplify in order to get things into this format. Here's a more sort of specific conference. This is a laboratory phonology conference, and it's more specialized. This is for just a subgroup of people working in a specific area of sound structure in phonetics and phonology. And you'll see that the guidelines are a little bit different because of the more specialized audience for this. So they should be written in English and not exceed one page of text, but you can put graphics and examples and figures and references on the second page. So really what you have is a page and a half or 2 pages of text. They give you a template for this one. And then again, more formatting requirements. You should certainly obey these. This one has more requirements for the name of the file as well. You have to anonymize it. For this one, because they have specific themes at the conference, they want to know which ones you're related to. They want keywords, and they have guidelines for how many different kinds of abstracts you're allowed to submit. But this is going to be a slightly more extensive format that allows for a little bit more space to stretch out and talk about your work. And so, yeah, this is the kind of formats that you get. It's very rarely more than a page or 2. It's often going to be even less than that. Like I've seen ones that are 300 words before. I think I once saw one that was a 150 word abstract, which is 1 paragraph. That's pretty common in journal articles where it's just meant to be a summary of the work. So people can decide whether they want to read the paper or not. 150 or 200 words is pretty typical for those ones. Right? How are we going to do this? What are we going to do? Well, so this section draws pretty heavily from some online abstract advice guide that Maggie Tellerman, who's a linguist at Newcastle, has put on her website. And a lot of the text here comes from that document. It's worth looking at. It's pretty interesting. So first piece of advice, before you begin writing, the most important task is to know what you're intending to talk about. Should your paper be accepted? Right? It's pretty typical in linguistics, at least, for you to submit an abstract for research that's not done yet, right? It's often work in progress. And it's often the case that you don't know exactly what the talk is going to look like at the time you write the abstract. And so it's important to not make stuff up. And I say this because this is something that happens. You'll sometimes get abstracts to linguistics conferences, especially if it doesn't involve experimental work, right? You can't fake that you've collected experimental data. But if you're talking about linguistic data, like qualitative normal data from a language, you might have some ideas about how this construction in this language works. And then you say in the abstract, I'm going to offer a full analysis of this that will have the following properties, but you don't actually describe the analysis in any detail. That's a terrible idea because reviewers can see right through that. And so don't pretend to have more done than you actually do. You should know what your talk is going to be about when you write the abstract. That might seem basic, but it's surprising how many people sort of violate this. The other issue here that I think she's getting at is that sometimes, especially if people are writing a dissertation and trying to go out to the conferences to make themselves visible and get jobs and stuff, they'll submit an abstract that's like their entire PhD dissertation. To give in a 20-minute talk. I say this, I basically did that myself. It was an awful idea. And so be careful about that. Make sure that it's something you can fit in the actual allotted time for a talk at the conference. You also will find at some conferences people who go over the talk allotted time for their talks, which is distressingly common, at least in basic linguistics. It's incredibly rude. To the audience, to the organizers, to the other speakers. Do not be this person. You see this all the time. It's most often, I'm going to say, more senior men in the profession who do this, and it is really incredibly frustrating. If you only go over your allotted time by a little bit, then maybe you just miss out on the discussion part of your talk. But if you go over by a lot, you're cutting into the time of other speakers, which is incredibly inconsiderate, and you're putting the organizers in this awful situation of having to cut you off while you're still talking. Do not do this. Keep track of the time during your talk if you give a talk at a conference, and don't go over the time limit. What should be in the abstract? Well, it should basically cover these points, normally in this order. What is the problem or the research question that I'm going to discuss? Explain or describe or illustrate the specific examples of this problem or research question that I'm talking about, and explain what the problem is with earlier work, if there is some problem with earlier work, and then describe your solution, or at least some work that you've done that's a substantive chunk of work that helps solve the problem, even if you don't have a full solution yet. And this is going to be essentially the same advice, whether you're submitting, descriptive data from an understudied language, or an experiment about the processing of voice onset time, and or whether you're going to be talking about some kind of a teaching intervention. You're going to want to follow basically these steps in an abstract. Right? So what did each of these involve? The statement of the problem or the research question. So you want to begin by stating, what is this talk about? What's the problem I'm trying to address? And of course, you're very familiar with your topic. You've been working on it for months at this point, maybe years, and you have lots of background and you understand what it's about, but the panel reviewing the abstract usually isn't. So even at a specialist conference, I know lots of stuff about phonetics and phonology, but if you're submitting a paper on the phonetics of stress in Arapaho, I don't know anything about how stress works in Arapaho, or maybe anything about the sound system of Arapaho in general. You have to state that background and the background area of the paper in sufficiently general terms that anybody can read the abstract and understand broadly what's going on. Don't jump right into the problem without explaining what the problem is about first, right? And so she's giving all these examples here. Many of her examples in these quotes are from theoretical syntax, but the same thing is true for any other area of basic or applied linguistics. Don't assume that people have all the background that you have, especially about theories in your area. A lot of poor abstracts fail to do this, and instead they launch right into the details of, what kind of data analysis they're going to do. So you do want to give some background. Of course, given the constraints of length, you have to still get to the general point of the paper pretty quickly within the first few sentences. Another useful idea here, which we already talked about, or at least I lectured about during the literature review part of the class, is the idea of decomposing or factorizing a research question into its component parts, right? So if my topic that I'm submitting an abstract about is this question: can infants learn to segment speech into words by tracking transitional probabilities? The answer, by the way, appears to be yes, they can. But here's what this is about. Infant language learning times word segmentation times transitional probabilities, or statistical learning, or something like that. And so I'm going to state the general theme of the paper, something that's going to look a lot like this question, but presumably in sentence form. And then I'm going to give a bit of background on each of these topics. What is infant language learning like? What is word segmentation like? How does statistical learning or transitional probability work? Maybe one sentence for each of these concepts. Then the next section is going to explain how all of them interact, and hopefully, even if the reviewer gets to that second paragraph where I'm talking about my specific results or my specific research design, and they can't understand something, they're at least going to be able to look back in the first paragraph and be like, oh, well, the abstract is about this thing. Maybe that's what I'm missing here, right? So this is a general sort of strategy. First, pick apart the basic research topics that go into your question, and then move on to the way that you're combining or interacting various factors in your study. A description or an illustration of the phenomenon under discussion. What does that mean? In theoretical linguistics, this is often going to be examples from a language or from some group of languages. Like, Arapaho has penultimate stress that's affected by the presence of a nasal in the coda of the second to last syllable. And then you give a bunch of words that shows how that works, right? In other areas of inquiry, it will more likely be a summary of the results from some previous study. In this study, we're going to be studying word segmentation. Smith and Jones, 1999, found that infants can segment words given this kind of a signal, right? So this is sort of the problem or the phenomenon that we're starting with. In some cases, it might just be a logical statement, right? So not necessarily about previous results or anything like that, but in order to master writing in a foreign language, students must first, do X, Y, and Z, or have this kind of knowledge. And that's not something you necessarily need to support with citations or anything like that. It's just a logical problem, right? It's the problem that you're trying to address. A statement of the empirical and or theoretical inadequacies of earlier work on the topic. Again, because her guide is more geared towards theoretical syntax, this is going to be almost universally present in a theoretical linguistics type of abstract. This might be more minimal or maybe not even present in other kinds of abstracts, although, excuse me, if you're doing anything empirical, at the very least you want to explain what the gap is in our knowledge that you're trying to fill, which is really a statement of the empirical inadequacy of earlier work on the topic. So that would fit into this category, right? So it's likely that your paper is going to be a response to earlier work because we've done all this literature review and we've thought very carefully about our research questions. And so you're probably going to want to state why and in what way your research improves on existing work, right? Giving citations for that work where relevant. This needs to be done very delicately, right? So you don't want to just insult earlier work. You don't want to say like, Blog's solution relies on this terrible mechanism, or Blog's ad hoc non-solution to the problem really doesn't solve the issue. Blog might be reviewing your abstract, so don't say that. She recommends just stating this very straightforwardly. So Blog 1997 can't account for the following facts. So some conferences will ask you to print out the full references on a second page, but sometimes you can get away with just using author year if they're not too concerned with full references in the abstract. If they count these references as part of your abstract space. So it might be guidelines like you get one page including references, then try to minimize the number of references that you include there to the absolute minimum number that you need to make the point you're making. You don't want to waste your precious abstract space with references if you can avoid it. Of course, many conferences will allow you to either omit that or put it on a separate page. This is a kind of tricky part as well, a solution or work towards a solution to the problem that you've identified. You have to convince people that you've done some work if you want them to give the abstract a good review. And frequently what we see are these things that Tallerman's calling a promissory note. I will present a solution to this problem. Well, that's not good enough. You need to describe what your solution is, what kind of an analysis you're giving, what kind of results you have, what kind of an argument you're making in enough detail for it to be evaluated, right? So somebody needs to be able to look at your brief summary of your results or your conclusions or your arguments and say, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. I'd like to hear more about that. Now, they're probably not going to understand every single subtlety of what you're proposing. There's no way you're going to be able to get all of that into an abstract. So you have to simplify. One problem I run into when I'm doing things like this is if I'm leaving out relevant details, I almost feel like I'm lying, right? Like I'm saying that this thing is true, but really this thing is true, except for these two other things that I'm going to talk about if I have time. You can't think like that. So you have to understand it's not dishonesty. The genre is asking you to omit lots of details of your work in order to present a coherent narrative. That's not dishonesty. That's tailoring the description of your work to the venue in which you are trying to present it, which is an extremely short written presentation of a summary of your work. It's fine to omit all sorts of relevant details when you write these abstracts. That's basically what they're for. She goes on to point out that the visual layout of the abstract, she says, is extremely important. I would probably qualify that to some extent. I mean, it can be important. Hopefully people who are reviewing these abstracts are not putting too much weight on things like this, because that really wouldn't be appropriate. But it is probably true that what your abstract looks like will have some effect on how people initially react to it. And she says it can influence the decision whether to accept or reject your paper. I like to think that that's not making much of a difference to me when I review these, but maybe it is. It's not like you would necessarily know if this were having an outsized effect on your decisions. In any case, these two general principles are useful principles that are worth paying attention to. Don't try to trick or the abstract guidelines or game them or steal space by getting as many words as you can on every line. Or by not leaving any spaces between your numbered examples or your figures or anything like that. It might allow you to get a little bit more information of the abstract, but it's also going to be obvious what you're doing. The reviewer is going to look at the abstract and be like, why couldn't this person have just eliminated 2 more sentences and made it easier to read? And then also, it's going to visually make your abstract sort of unpleasant to look at. So it's worth having some space in here. And, it's hard to get it down to the right length, but trying to game the system by cramming in extra stuff is as likely to backfire as it is to actually help the abstract. And then the other issue here, which at least for me comes up less often, is also don't make the abstract too short, right? If they tell you that you have a one single space page, in order to present your idea, and you write a single paragraph that's double spaced, and then you have 2 inches of empty space at the end of the page, it looks like you don't have anything to talk about. So you also don't want to leave too much space in the abstract, or people might conclude something negative about your work. Titles. This is kind of an interesting topic. And so this is Tellerman's advice. Of course, reasonable people can disagree about these things. Your title should reflect what the paper is about as closely as possible, but shouldn't be too long. A snappy title is okay if it really works, but it may also be a good idea to have a more sober subtitle following a colon. And so this is one common format where you give sort of main title, colon, more specific description. So I've given some examples of different types of titles that you get, at least in basic linguistics here. This first type is actually combining several of these. So this has the form main title colon secondary title. You get that a lot. This one also has the form of a declarative assertion about your results. This is pretty common in linguistics. It's a possible thing you can do. English flapping is not neutralizing. This is referring to a particular phonological pattern in English and its formal properties. And so this is an empirical claim about this particular phonological process that is presumably going to be argued for in this work. How are we going to argue for it? Experimental evidence. Right? So this is one kind of a format people use a lot. A more general description of what your topic is about. Acquisition of Russian case by adult learners. This has the advantage of being sort of understandable and specifying very clearly what area the abstract or the presentation will be in. It doesn't really say anything about what you found, but it's a reasonable title. Here's general topic, colon, what kind of study is this? Genre analysis in the classroom, an exploratory study. So again, this sort of primary title, subtitle organization, you get that a lot. Perceptual similarity, phonological contrast, and second language acquisition. So this is, again, a much more general thing, but you often get these series of 3 topics, right? So my talk is going to be about the interaction of these 3 things. X, comma, Y, comma, and Z, comma is my title. Right? And then this is the kind of catchy one that Taylorman is talking about. You do occasionally get these. It's a kind of risky strategy. This one is from a phonology conference where somebody was giving a talk about, there's a technical word for these linguistic terms that I can't remember the name of, but it's words for people from a particular place. So people from West Virginia are West Virginians, people from Cambridge are Cantabrigians, people from Boston are Bostonians, and so on and so forth. And this was a talk about those kinds of constructions. And the name of the talk is, what do you call a person from ... Right? So this is sort of a catchy or jokey title. There's lots of these in linguistics. If you know your audience really well and you're sure you've got a good, funny title, then go for it. But, it's less of a safe strategy than just giving a simple descriptive title. Okay, so in the next part, we're going to take a look at some actual abstracts that were submitted to an actual conference that I reviewed. And we'll see, we're going to pick these apart and see how well they do and ask about what do you think could be improved in these. And then I'll tell you what actually happened with each of those abstracts. That'll be in the next part.